Have you ever noticed how some sounds linger in your memory, long after the moment has passed? For Samuel Wright, it's a sound of a train moving through town at the edge of evening, low, steady, and fading into the kind of silence that seems to hold its breath. There's nothing extraordinary about this train. It doesn't stop here. It doesn't bring news or take anyone away. But every dusk, as the sky drapes itself in amber and violet, it arrives like a familiar chapter in a well-loved book, predictable yet somehow different each time. In the quiet town where Samuel lives, the train's passing is as much a part of the day as the first light of morning or the last sip of tea before bed, and yet, within that simple moment lies a lifetime of memories, some too tender to speak aloud, and others so small you might miss them, unless you were sitting right there beside him. Tonight, I'd like to take you to that porch, to watch the day soften into night, and to hear the train pass at dusk. There is a certain hour in the evening when the light seems to loosen its grip on the day, falling gently over the rooftops as if it's reluctant to leave. In Samuel Wright's small Kentucky town, that hour comes with a softness you can almost touch. The sun slides low between the hills, casting the long shadows of barns and sycamores across the quiet streets, and the air changes, cooler now, carrying the faint scent of cut hay and wood smoke. Samuel has always noticed these shifts. Perhaps it comes from the years he's lived here, watching the same hills through all the seasons. Or perhaps it's because, in the slowing of the day, he finds a language he understands. The world becomes less urgent in that in-between light, and the sounds carry differently. The creak of a porch step across the street, the muffled slam of a screen door 2 houses down, the distant laughter of children whose game will end when their mothers call them in for supper. From the back porch of his own house, an old frame home with a roof of corrugated tin and a paint job more weathered than fresh, Samuel can see the line of track that runs west of town. It's only a narrow strip of steel between 2 gravel beds, but to him, it's as much a part of the town story as the church steeple or the county store. The trains have been running through for longer than he's been alive, though in his boyhood they used to stop. The depot still stands, brick walls faded and window frames empty, the bench out front smooth and worn from decades of waiting. Now it sits, abandoned, watching the trains pass as silently as any of the townsfolk. Samuel's chair is always in the same spot, angled so he can see the tracks if he leans forward just a bit. The seat is deep and low, its slats polished by years of his own weight, and the smooth brushing of his hands over the arms. He sits there most evenings with a mug of tea cupped between his palms. Sometimes the tea is still warm when the train comes. Sometimes it's cooled entirely. The warmth or the chill doesn't matter. It's the waiting that's important. Waiting has a way of slowing a man down, of making him notice things he'd otherwise pass by. The way the light catches on the edges of the gravel, the way the tall grass sways in the ditch beside the track, bending in one long whisper when the wind shifts, the way a barn swallow arcs high above the field, its wings glinting in the last of the sun. When Samuel was younger, his evenings looked different. There were chores to finish, errands to run, the hum of life moving just a little faster. Mary was often beside him in those days, her voice mixing with the clink of dishes as they washed up after supper, or her laughter carrying through the open windows on summer nights. But now the house is quieter, and his days unfold with fewer demands. The rhythm he keeps is one of choice, not obligation, and in that rhythm there is always room for the train. It begins as a murmur on the edge of hearing, Some evenings, it's so faint at first that he wonders if it's only his mind, filling in the sound he expects, but then it grows, bit by bit, until it hums through the boards of the porch and settles low in his chest. The sound has a weight to it, steady and sure, like a heartbeat far off but moving closer. Samuel leans forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and lets it come. The train does not hurry. It moves at the same pace it always has, deliberate and measured, as though it knows there's no need to rush through this small stretch of land. Its horn calls out, a long, low note that drapes itself over the fields and the rooftops, and in that sound is something both present and deeply old. Samuel closes his eyes and listens, and the years fold in on themselves. He can see himself as a boy, standing at the edge of the depot platform, his father's broad hand on his shoulder. He can smell the coal smoke, sharp and rich, and feel the way the wooden boards vibrate under the soles of his shoes. He remembers the faces of strangers stepping down from the cars, their expressions softening as they take in the town, some with relief, others with a kind of searching hope, and always, somewhere in the crowd, Mary, whether she was truly there every time or whether his mind has simply placed her in those memories, he can't say. But in the remembering, she is as much a part of the station as the bench or the clock above the door. The sound of the train draws him back to the present, though not sharply. It's more like drifting from one room into another, carrying the air of the first room with you. The steel wheels click and rumble over the track, a rhythm that holds no urgency, and Samuel breathes with it. The smell of his tea mingles with the faint tang of the metal in the air, and for a moment he feels suspended, half in the life he's lived, half in the one still moving toward him from down the line. As the train nears the old depot, the light shifts again. The sky is no longer gold, but a deepening amber at the horizon, shading into blue above. The windows of the freight cars catch the last of the sun and send it flickering across the gravel, a warm pulse that passes quickly and does not return. Samuel watches until the final car has gone, the hum of the rails lingering in the air long after the train is out of sight. There is no applause for the passing, no announcement, no crowd to wave it off, just the quiet settling back in, the way a pond grows still after a fish has broken the surface. Samuel leans back in his chair, the wooden slats creaking softly, and lets the evening gather around him again. Somewhere in the distance a dog barks once, then falls silent. The crickets begin their steady chorus. The train will come again tomorrow and the day after, and likely for the rest of his days. It is a constant in a world that shifts in ways both small and large, and Samuel has come to see its passing as a kind of prayer, unspoken, unhurried, and deeply known. He lifts his mug and takes the last sips, the tea now cool against his tongue. Then he sits for a while longer, watching the light fade entirely from the tracks, until there is only the dark and the sound of his own breath, moving steady in and out, like the rhythm of the wheels on steel, carrying him gently toward the night. Morning in Samuel's town comes quietly, as if the sun itself is careful not to wake anyone too suddenly. The first light drifts over the ridges like a slow-moving tide, touching the tops of the trees before spilling into the fields. It gathers in the dew on the grass, turning each drop into a pearl for just a moment before it warms and disappears. Samuel rises with that light, not because of an alarm or a pressing obligation, but because it's his way. Years of working at the post office trained him to greet the day early, and the habit has settled into him like the grain of wood in a table. He moves through the house without turning on lights, letting the dim gray of morning guide him. The kettle on the stove hums faintly as it heats, and he stands by the counter, waiting, listening to the small sounds the house makes in its waking. Timbers creaking softly, the clock ticking in the front room, the faint rustle of leaves just beyond the windows. When the tea is ready, he carries his mug to the porch. In the early hours, the town feels like it belongs only to him and the birds. Sparrows dart from the fence to the hedge and back again, quick flashes of brown and white. A mourning dove calls from somewhere near the tracks, its low, plaintive note lingering in the still air. Samuel takes a sip, the warmth spreading through his chest, and rests his hand on the arm of the chair. He can see the depot from here, even in the soft haze of morning. The old building looks different at this hour, less like a relic and more like a sentinel keeping watch. Its bricks, dulled by years of weather, take on a gentle glow in the slanted light, and the windows, though empty, hold the sky like framed pieces of glass. Sometimes, in this light, Samuel almost imagines he could walk down there and find it as it was. The doors open, the station master in his vest and cap, the faint scent of coal smoke hanging in the air. Those memories don't come as a rush, but as a slow unfolding, like a letter read carefully, line by line. He remembers the mornings when the train would arrive before the sun had fully risen, bringing with it the sound of boots on the platform and the murmur of voices. He would stand with his father, a boy with the cap too big for his head, watching as travelers stepped down with suitcases, their breath visible in the cold air. Some mornings Mary would be there too, arriving on the early train from Lexington, her cheeks pink from the chill, her eyes bright with something she'd read in a book on the way. He thinks of the time they first spoke, not much more than a few words about the weather and the frost on the tracks, but he remembers the way her voice fit into that morning, as naturally as the train's whistle or the scrape of a broom on the platform. Over the years, their conversations lengthened, though the silences between them never felt empty. They could sit on that bench for the better part of an hour without saying much, just watching the town wake around them, and it would be enough. Samuel leans back now, the mug warm in his hands, and lets the morning settle over him. The train won't come until evening, but the knowledge of its eventual passing is a quiet thread in his day. He likes to think of it as a kind of anchor, a fixed point he can measure the hours against. The rhythm of life here is built on such anchors. The noon bell from the church, the delivery truck stopping at the store, the long shadows stretching across the fields in late afternoon. After finishing his tea, he takes a slow walk to the end of his street. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and early blooms. Along the way, he passes Mrs. Langley's garden, where tulips are just beginning to open, their petals still holding last night's rain. A few houses down, Mr. Carson is sweeping his porch, pausing to lean on the broom and wave. Samuel returns the gesture, their exchange wordless but full of the kind of familiarity that only comes from decades of seeing each other in small, ordinary moments. The road curves slightly as it approaches the edge of town, and from there he can see the tracks more clearly. They stretch north and south, disappearing into the distance in both directions, the steel glinting faintly. The grass along the ballast is dotted with dandelions, their yellow heads bright against the gray stones. A breeze stirs them, carrying the faint clink of a metal sign swinging on its post near the depot. Standing there, Samuel feels the same calm he always does near the tracks. It's not just about the trains, though they are part of it. It's about the way this place holds time. Here, moments seem to collect and settle instead of rushing away. The past doesn't vanish, it lingers in the air, in the worn wood of the platform, in the way the gravel shifts under his boots. He thinks of all the goodbyes and welcomes that have happened on these boards, the way each one must have left some trace, invisible but present. As he turns to head home, he takes the long way, following a path through a stand of sycamores. The trees are tall and pale, their bark peeling in soft curls that catch the light. Beneath them, the ground is soft with last year's leaves, and the air smells faintly of the creek nearby. He pauses for a while to listen, the steady trickle of water over stones, the gentle tapping of a woodpecker in the distance. These are the sounds that fill the spaces between the train's comings and goings, and Samuel treasures them just as much. Back at the house, he settles into the rhythm of his day. There are letters to write, notes to old friends he keeps in touch with through paper and ink, the way he always has. There's bread to bake, the scent of yeast and flour warming the kitchen as the dough rises. There's a chair to fix, its loose rung waiting patiently for the touch of his hands. And all the while, in the quiet places of his mind, the evening waits. The light will change again, the air will cool, and the train will come. Samuel doesn't need to watch the clock. He'll know by the way the shadows shift across the yard, by the way the doves call from the eaves, by the hush that falls over the town just before the rails begin to hum. When that moment arrives, it will be as it always is, steady, unhurried, and carrying with it the threads of all the evenings before. And Samuel will be there, on his porch, ready to meet it. By late afternoon, the day in Samuel's town is thinned into that gentle in-between time when the sunlight feels warmer than the air itself. The work of the day, what little there is for most, has slowed. You can feel it in the way a shopkeeper lingers at the doorway, leaning on the frame to watch the street, or in how a neighbor pauses at the edge of her garden to rest her hands on her hips and simply look at the rows she's tended. For Samuel, this is the hour when the edges between memory and present begin to blur. He sits on his porch with his second cup of tea, steam curling from it in thin threads, and his gaze drifts, sometimes toward the tracks, sometimes across the yard, but more often toward a place that doesn't exist on any map. A place built from the small enduring pieces of a life lived alongside another. Mary comes to him most vividly in these hours, not as a ghost, not as a sharp pang of grief, but as a steady presence, like the way a familiar song can play in the background of a room without anyone needing to turn it on. She appears in the rustle of the wind through the lilac bushes, in the slant of light across the porch boards, in the faint scent of bread from the kitchen. And always, she comes when the thought of the evening train starts to settle in. He remembers one particular autumn, long ago but bright in his mind, when the two of them walked down to the depot together just as the light was leaving the sky. The air had that cool clarity it gets in October, carrying the scent of distant wood smoke. Mary had worn a scarf the color of late leaves, and each time the breeze caught it, it lifted behind her like a ribbon. They didn't speak much on the way, their footsteps falling in a quiet rhythm on the gravel path. At the platform, they found the bench empty. They sat close, knees brushing, and watched as the rails began to hum under the weight of something still far off. The sound came slowly at first, like the approach of rain, and Mary smiled without looking at him. "I like that we can hear it before we see it," she'd said, her voice low. It's like it gives us a moment to ready ourselves. When the train appeared, a string of dark silhouettes against the last pale band of the sky, they both leaned forward as if to catch it in their hands. Samuel remembered how the windows flickered with light from inside the cars, tiny scenes moving past too quickly to grasp. A woman reading beneath a small lamp, a boy with his face pressed to the glass, a man resting his head against the seat back, eyes closed, moments from other lives passing through the edges of their own. Mary had reached for his hand then, not tightly, just enough to feel the shape of it, and in that moment the world felt as though it had folded itself neatly around the two of them. Train, town, sky, and all. Now, all these years later, Samuel holds that memory gently, turning it over like a stone in his pocket. The scarf, the hum of the rails, the flicker of other lives in the windows, it is all still there, unchanged while so much else has moved on. The air this evening carries some of that same October sharpness, though the calendar says otherwise. Somewhere beyond the yard, a dog gives a single bark, then falls quiet. The shadows of the maple trees in front of the house stretch long across the street, their leaves trembling faintly with each passing breeze. Samuel takes another slow sip of tea, feeling the warmth move through him. In his mind, he hears the echo of Mary's voice. It's like it gives us a moment to ready ourselves. He thinks about that often now, not just in relation to the train, but to life itself. How many moments, he wonders, had been given to him as a kind of preparation for what was coming, without him even knowing. As the light softens further, he leans back in his chair, letting his gaze wander toward the western horizon. The hills there hold the sun a little longer, keeping the last of its warmth before releasing it to the night. The sky above them has begun its slow turn to gold, then amber, and soon, he knows, to that deepening blue that will welcome the first stars. He can almost feel the train already, its distant weight moving steadily along the line, each wheel a measured heartbeat against the steel. Soon, its call will drift over the fields and into the town, weaving itself through every open window and quiet street. But for now, he waits. Waiting has become its own kind of work for him, patient and unhurried. It is in the waiting that the memories come most clearly, not to pull him back, but to sit beside him, like an old friend settling into the next porch chair. Somewhere in the far distance, too soft yet to be certain, a hum begins. Samuel smiles faintly, not needing to check the time. The day is ready to hand itself over to the night, and he is ready to meet it, as he always has, with a still heart and an open ear. The first sign that the train is near is not the sound, but the change in the air. Samuel has learned this after decades of evenings spent waiting. The breeze shifts, bringing with it the faint scent of iron and dust, as if the rails themselves are breathing out before the great weight arrives. It is subtle, the sort of thing you might miss if your mind is elsewhere, but for Samuel, it's the cue that the moment is drawing close. He sits forward in his chair, tea mug resting loosely in his hands, elbows on his knees. The western sky is lit in shades of fading gold and pale rose, the colors so soft they seem almost unwilling to leave. Long shadows from the maples spill across his yard, the shapes of their branches stretching and swaying slightly in the evening breeze. In the distance, somewhere beyond the first ridge, a dove calls, a slow, hollow note that seems to echo in the quiet spaces of the town. And then, like a memory stepping gently into the present, the hum begins. low at first, barely distinguishable from the other sounds of evening. Samuel does not move. He lets it grow on its own, unhurried, until the rhythm becomes certain. The steady thrum of steel wheels on steel rails is carrying something through the heart of his small town. The whistle follows, long and low, folding itself into the air and lingering there, so that for a moment the town itself seems to pause and listen. Samuel has always liked that, how the train announces itself in a way that is neither demanding nor shy. It doesn't rush through its greeting, it gives everyone a chance to notice. He remembers hearing that same whistle on winter nights, years ago when the snow muffled every other sound and the house was warm with lamplight. He and Mary would be sitting by the fire, her hands wrapped around a mug, the flames reflecting in her eyes. When the whistle came, she would glance toward the window with a small smile, as though it was an old friend calling from down the street. Even then, when life was busier and the days felt shorter, they would always take a moment to listen. The sound grows now, filling the spaces between the houses, sliding down the narrow streets and over the rooftops. Samuel sets his mug down on the porch railing and leans back, letting the vibration reach him. There's something grounding in it, the way it comes from far away and passes so close before continuing on. It reminds him that there are places beyond these hills, other lives unfolding at this very moment, and yet here, in his small corner, there is stillness enough to hold it all gently. Soon he can see the faint glint of the engine's light through the gap in the trees, a flicker against the darker shapes of the hills. The sound deepens as the train rounds the bend, its long body trailing behind like a slow-moving river. The cars pass one by one, each carrying something he cannot see. Wooden crates, sacks of grain, perhaps machinery bound for another town. He has never been tempted to chase the train or follow it beyond the limits of the town. His life is here, among these streets and fields, among the people whose footsteps he knows by sound. Watching the train pass is not about wanting to be elsewhere. It's about being reminded that the world is wide, and that this quiet place is his chosen piece of it. The whistle sounds again as the train nears the old depot. The building stands with its empty windows catching the last light, its bricks holding the day's warmth. For a moment, Samuel imagines it as it once was, the platform alive with movement, the air rich with the scent of smoke and oil, Mary's scarf bright against the dusk. The vision passes easily, not as a sharp ache, but as a kindness, a reminder that those days live on inside him. The train continues south, each car shrinking into the distance until only the sound remains, thinning like the final lines of a song. Samuel stays in his chair, listening to the fading hum in the rails, feeling the night begin to gather around him. The crickets resume their chorus, the leaves rustle overhead, and the air cools against his skin. In this gentle closing of the day, Samuel feels no rush to move. He sits for a while longer, tracing the memory of the whistle through the evening air, letting it settle where all the other evenings have settled, quietly, without fanfare, in the deep well of his life. The light is nearly gone now, but there's still enough to see the soft outline of the hills against the sky. He knows the stars will appear soon, one by one, the same way the train's hum had risen from silence. There is comfort in that pattern, in the way one thing gives way to another, each making space for what follows. When he finally stands, it's with the slow ease of someone who has no need to hurry. He picks up his empty mug, glances once more toward the tracks, and steps inside, the screen door clicking gently behind him. The train is gone, but its passing lingers in the air, a reminder that even the simplest moments can hold the weight of a whole life. And tomorrow, when the day begins to soften again, he will be here to meet it. Morning returns without ceremony. It does not rush into Samuel's room, nor does it shake him from his sleep. It arrives the way it always does, quietly, patiently, seeping through the thin curtains, painting a pale stripe across the wooden floorboards. The house holds a stillness that feels almost like a companion, the kind that sits with you in peace and asks for nothing. Samuel wakes slowly, as if surfacing through layers of warm water. There's no alarm clock to demand his attention, no schedule pressing him into motion. Instead, he listens to the first small sounds of the day, the kettle clicking faintly in the kitchen from last night's heat, the old clock in the front room marking each second in its steady, familiar way, and beyond the walls, the soft chatter of sparrows greeting one another from the hedges. He swings his legs over the side of the bed, feet finding the coolness of the floor, and sits there for a moment with his hands resting loosely on his knees. The air carries the faintest chill, a reminder that summer's ease is giving way to the gentler light of early autumn. He takes his time dressing, pulling on an old flannel shirt, its sleeves frayed at the cuffs, and stepping into his well-worn boots. In the kitchen, he fills the kettle and sets it on the stove. While the water heats, he moves to the back door and pushes it open. The porch boards creak under his weight as he steps outside, greeted by the damp scent of earth and leaves still holding last night's dew. From here, he can see the mist hanging low over the fields beyond the tracks, softening the line where the land meets the sky. When the kettle begins its low whistle, Samuel returns inside, pours the steaming water over a spoonful of loose tea, and waits for it to steep. He doesn't mind waiting, never has. It's in the waiting that he notices the small things, how the morning light shifts from silver to gold as it touches the kitchen wall, how the steam curls upward in slow, lazy spirals, how the warmth from the mug seeps into his palms. He carries the tea to the porch and settles into his chair. It's the same chair from last night, the same view, but the morning dresses it differently. The rails are still and silent, holding the pale reflection of the sky. The depot stands in its usual quiet stance, its bricks catching just enough sunlight to hint at their old, richer color. Somewhere, a dog barks twice before the sound is swallowed by the open space. Sipping his tea, Samuel thinks of the path that runs alongside the tracks, the one he hasn't walked in some weeks. It's a narrow trail, worn into the grass over years of footsteps, leading north out of town before it bends toward the river. He decides he will take it today, with no aim other than to see what the morning chooses to show him. After finishing his tea, he sets the mug inside and steps out the front gate. The air is cool enough to redden his cheeks, and each breath carries a faint sweetness from the wildflowers scattered in the ditches. His boots make a soft sound on the gravel road, the kind of rhythm that invites a person to match their thoughts to their steps. When he reaches the tracks, he pauses to look both ways, not for safety, but out of habit. The rails stretch into the distance like two fine pencil lines, fading into the pale haze. He begins north, his pace unhurried. Grasshoppers click away from his boots, leaping into the safety of the weeds. The air here is thick with the scent of sun-warmed grass, though the sun is still climbing. The path passes behind the backyards of a few houses, each with its own quiet story. A clothesline strung with white shirts sways gently in the breeze. A garden plot, neat and ordered, waits for the next round of planting. At one fence, a pair of hens scratch in the dirt, pausing now and then to lift their heads toward him before returning to their work. Further on, the houses give way to open land. The fields here are wide, their edges marked by lines of sycamore and oak. The morning mist curls and drifts through the low places, catching the light in soft, shifting patterns. Samuel stops for a moment to watch it move, the way it seems to both conceal and reveal the land at once. He reaches the bend where the trail dips toward the river. The water is low this time of year, the stones along the banks exposed and white in the sunlight. He finds a flat rock and sits, resting his hands on his knees, breathing in the scent of the river, part earth, part leaves, part something clean and metallic that only moving water carries. The river here runs slow, curling lazily around a bend before disappearing behind the trees. Samuel watches as a single leaf, golden and dry, drifts down from a branch and lands on the surface, spinning gently as a current takes it. The scene brings Mary to mind again, how she used to walk with him here, carrying a small basket for the wildflowers she liked to gather. She would kneel by the bank, her hands moving among the stems with the care that made each flower seem important. He sits by the river for a long while, letting the sound of the water smooth the edges of his thoughts. There is no train in the morning, no whistle to mark the passing of time, but he feels its quiet presence all the same. It is there in the stillness of the rails, in the way the town breathes in and out, in the unbroken line of days that lead one into another. When he finally stands to make his way home, the sun has climbed higher, burning away the mist and turning the fields to gold. The air has warmed, but the morning still holds its gentleness. Samuel follows the trail back, his steps steady, the sight of the depot ahead growing clearer with each turn. Back at the porch, he sits again with a fresh mug of tea. The tracks lie quiet in the sunlight, but he knows that by dusk they will hum with life once more. Until then, he will go about his day, writing a letter, mending a chair, tending the small things that keep a life whole, while the waiting works its way quietly through him, like the slow current of the river, carrying him toward the evening. By midday, the sunlight has settled into a steady, golden warmth, neither sharp nor fading, just present like a quiet companion. Samuel moves through the rooms of his house without urgency, each step unhurried, each task allowed the time it needs. There's bread cooling on the counter, its crust split open to release a fragrance that seems to fill not just the kitchen, but the whole house. The slow tick of the clock in the front room measures the day in even beats, untroubled by whatever hours pass between them. In the afternoon, with the small chores finished, Samuel decides to open the cedar chest that sits against the wall in the spare room. It's been months since he last looked inside. The chest itself is a familiar thing, its surface worn smooth by decades of use, its lid etched with faint marks from the time something heavy had rested there. He kneels in front of it and lifts the lid. The hinges creak, the sound soft but distinct, like the clearing of a throat before a story is told. Inside are the things he and Mary had gathered over a lifetime, kept not for their monetary worth, but because they hold the kind of value that cannot be counted. Folded quilts, their patterns faded but still clear enough to recognize. A stack of letters tied with ribbon, a jar of buttons, each one different, collected from shirts and coats long since worn through. His hand moves slowly over the contents, pausing at each item. It is not nostalgia that holds him there, but something gentler. the quiet recognition of a life built from countless small moments. He lifts one of the quilts, unfolding it just enough to see the patch of pale blue cloth sewn into one corner. Mary had made this quilt the winter after their first harvest together, piecing it together from scraps of old work shirts and the remains of a summer dress she'd worn until the seams gave way. Beneath the quilts, wrapped in tissue paper that crackles faintly, he finds a small tin box. Its lid is painted with the faded image of a train crossing a bridge, the paint worn thin in places. Samuel remembers the day Mary found it in a second-hand shop in Lexington. She had pressed it into his hands and said, with a playful smile, "For your ticket stubs and all the little things you think you'll forget." Opening the tin, Samuel finds that it still holds exactly what she had imagined. Small, ordinary pieces of their shared days. A ticket stub from the county fair, the ink almost gone. A pressed leaf from a walk along the river. A scrap of paper with Mary's handwriting. "Meet me at the depot bench just before the evening train." The date written beside it is decades old, but the words feel as fresh as if she'd left them on his kitchen table this morning. He sits back on his heels, holding the paper between his fingers. The memory comes easily. That evening, the sky the color of warm honey, the air cool enough for a jacket. He had found her there at the depot, her scarf lifting in the breeze, her eyes catching the last light of the day. They had sat together until the train came and went, speaking little, the shared quiet between them saying more than any words could have. Setting the note gently back into the tin, Samuel closes the lid and rests his hand on it for a moment longer. It is not sadness that moves through him now, but a kind of fullness, a reminder that the love they shared still lives here, not in the objects themselves, but in the way they hold the shape of her presence. He replaces everything in the chest just as it was, folding the quilts, tucking the tin beneath them. When the lid closes, the room seems to hold a slightly different light, as if the act of remembering has shifted something in the air. Later, when he steps out to the porch, the day has begun its slow turn toward evening. The shadows stretch long across the yard, and the breeze carries with it the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. Samuel sits in his chair with a fresh cup of tea, the rails in the distance catching a thin ribbon of light. He thinks about the note again, "Meet me at the depot bench," and wonders at how certain moments can stay whole inside you, untouched by time. The train will pass soon, as it always does, and in its steady rhythm he will hear, not just the sound of steel on steel, but the quiet echo of footsteps beside him, the rustle of a scarf in the wind, the soft weight of a shared silence. The whistle will come, low and familiar, and he will be ready, not just for the train itself, but for the way it carries her back to him, if only for the length of its passing. And when it is gone, the quiet will settle again, as it always does, wrapping the town, the house, and his own steady heart in the comfort of what remains. The next day begins with a sky of pale blue and a softness in the air that hints of the season turning. The edges of summer are loosening and autumn is quietly making its way in, first in the cooler mornings, then in the faint scent of dry leaves carried on the wind. Samuel notices these changes the way other people notice the shifting of a familiar melody. They are not abrupt, but they stay with you once you've heard them. By late afternoon, he feels a quiet pull, not toward the porch this time, but toward the depot. It has been months since he last walked there, choosing instead the easy familiarity of watching the train from home. But today, he thinks, he might like to see it from the place where he and Mary once waited so many evenings. He sets out before the light begins to change, following the gravel road that leads west toward the tracks. The road curves gently, and as he walks, the sound of his boots on the stones blends with the faint murmur of the town, the rattle of dishes from someone's kitchen, the hum of a lawnmower far off, the faint laughter of children playing in a yard. He takes these sounds in without holding on to them, letting them pass through like a breeze that brushes the edge of a field. When the depot comes into view, it is exactly as he remembers. The red-brown bricks weathered and soft, the paint on the trim faded to a dull cream, the wide wooden bench sitting patiently against the wall. Grass grows in tufts between the platform boards, and a small cluster of wildflowers has found its way into the shade by the steps. Samuel steps onto the platform, the boards giving a slight creak under his weight. He moves to the bench and runs his hand along the armrest, feeling the smoothness worn into the wood by years of use. For a moment, he closes his eyes and lets the place settle around him. The smell of sun-warmed timber, the faint tang of iron from the rails, the way the air seems to hold its breath just before evening begins. He sits down, his hands resting lightly on his knees, and looks out toward the bend in the tracks where the train will first appear. It's still early yet. The shadows have only just begun to stretch across the platform. From here, the town feels a little farther away, as though the depot exists in its own small pocket of time. Memories come, as they always do in this place, but they arrive slowly, like the light deepening over the hills. He remembers Mary's habit of arriving a few minutes before him, already seated on the bench, her scarf tucked neatly into her coat. She would smile when she saw him, a smile that seemed to warm the air between them. They would sit together in that same comfortable silence, watching the horizon for the first sign of the train. Now, he watches alone, but not without company. The years have taught him that certain presences are not less real for being unseen. The bench feels as if it still holds the weight of their shared evenings, the wood carrying the imprint of their time together. A breeze stirs, carrying the dry, papery scent of early fallen leaves from somewhere down the line. Samuel leans back and lets the quiet fill the spaces between his thoughts. He doesn't think about much, just the way the shadows fall across the platform, the sound of the wind through the nearby sycamore, the warmth of the sun on his shoulder. And then it comes, the first low hum in the rails, almost too soft to notice at first. He hears it in his feet more than his ears, a vibration rising through the boards of the platform. He sits a little straighter, not in anticipation exactly, but in acknowledgement, as one might for the arrival of a trusted friend. The hum grows, steady and sure. The whistle follows, low and familiar, reaching out across the fields and into the edge of town. Samuel can feel it as much as hear it, the sound settling into the bones of the depot and into the wooden slats of the bench. When the train rounds the bend, the setting sun catches on its side, turning the metal to a deep, glowing copper. It moves at its usual pace, unhurried, deliberate, as if it knows the worth of taking its time. The cars pass in a steady rhythm, the click and clatter of the wheels blending with the whistle's fading echo. Samuel watches until the last car disappears beyond the far curve, the sound softening into the distance. The platform feels quieter now, but not empty. The air holds onto the trains passing for a little while, as if reluctant to let go. He stays seated, the light around him deepening into the soft blues and purples of early night. The first stars begin to appear, faint and tentative. Somewhere behind him, the town is settling into its own evening, doors closing, lights flickering on, voices dimming to murmurs. Eventually, Samuel stands, resting a hand once more on the arm of the bench. He does not rush his walk home. The road is gentle in the darkening light, and the crickets have taken up their song. The depot recedes behind him, but its presence lingers, not in sight, but in the calm it leaves within him. By the time he reaches his porch, the night is fully drawn, the sky spread wide with stars. The tracks lie quiet again, but he knows their stillness is only a pause. Tomorrow evening the train will pass once more, and he may come here to the bench again or watch from his porch. Either way, the rhythm will hold steady as breath, carrying with it the comfort of what endures. The walk home from the depot is unhurried, each step finding its own quiet place in the fading light. Samuel follows the curve of the road, the loose gravel shifting softly beneath his boots. On either side, the fields rest under the first wash of night, their colors muted now into shades of gray and silver. The air has cooled just enough to carry the faint scent of the earth settling after a day of sun. In the distance, the last sounds of the train fade into a hush, like a voice that has spoken its part and now leaves the evening to its own stillness. Samuel listens as that quietness grows, not an absence but a fullness, the way a room feels when all the company has gone, and yet their warmth lingers in the walls. A light wind moves through the sycamores by the roadside, stirring their broad leaves into a soft, papery conversation. Above them, the first real stars are making themselves known, steady pinpricks of light in the deepening sky. Samuel tips his head back for a moment, taking in the slow, patient way night arranges itself. By the time he reaches his house, the porch is wrapped in shadow, but the windows are glowing with the amber of lamplight. He pushes open the gate, the hinges giving their familiar creak, and steps onto the wooden boards. The porch smells faintly of the tea he left there earlier, now cooled, and of the lilacs by the steps whose fragrance lingers even after their blooms are gone. Inside, the house holds the kind of warmth that comes not from heat alone, but from the shape of a place well lived in. The walls seem to soften in the lamplight, their colors mellowed with age. Samuel sets his hat on the hook by the door and moves through the rooms with the ease of someone who knows every small sound and shadow. He lights the lamp on the kitchen table, its glow spreading across the worn wood and catching in the glass of the teapot. The kettle sits ready on the stove, and he fills it without thought, the simple action as much a part of his evening as the passing of the train. The quiet here is not absolute. There is the tick of the clock in the front room, the faint settling of the house as it adjusts to the cool outside, but these sounds belong to him as much as the furniture or the view from the window. While the water warms, Samuel stands at the back door and looks out over the yard. The grass is darker now, nearly black against the pale gravel of the drive. Fireflies begin their slow lantern work at the edges of the lawn, their brief pulsing light rising and falling in no hurry at all. He watches them for a while, until the kettle begins its low whistle. He pours the tea and carries the cup into the front room. Here, the lamplight is softer, pooling in the corners and leaving other parts of the room in gentle shadow. The armchair near the window waits for him, its cushions molded to his shape over years of use. He lowers himself into it, setting the cup on the small table beside him, and leans back with a sigh that feels as though it has been waiting all day to be released. From this chair, he can see the tracks if he leans just so, a faint silver line in the moonlight. They are quiet now, but Samuel knows that somewhere far down the line, another train is making its own way through the night, passing over rivers through small towns like his, carrying its steady hum into the dark. That thought brings him a kind of peace. The world is larger than this room, yet in this room, he holds all the pieces of the world he needs. He takes a sip of tea, the warmth curling through him, and lets his mind wander to Mary. Not to any one moment, but to the way her presence filled all the spaces of their life together. She is there in the worn quilt folded over the back of the chair, in the teacup with its small chip on the rim, in the books lined neatly on the shelf. He doesn't need to summon her. She lives here in the same way. The light lives in these rooms at dusk. The evening deepens. Outside, the crickets take up their patient chorus, joined now and then by the low, distant call of a night bird. The breeze shifts, brushing against the house in a way that makes the eaves murmur. Samuel closes his eyes, listening as the sounds layer themselves gently. Tea cooling in the cup beside him, the rustle of leaves, the steady tick of the clock, the breathing of the house. When he opens his eyes again, the moon has lifted higher, its light spilling over the porch and into the yard. The fireflies have spread themselves more thinly now, and their glow softer, slower. He feels the weight of the day settling into him, not a heaviness, but a kind of grounding, as though each moment has found its proper place. He finishes the last of his tea and sets the cup aside. The lamp burns low, its light a small circle in the larger darkness. Samuel sits for a while longer, letting the quiet press gently around him until it feels as though he is part of it. Another steady thing in the night, keeping company with the rails, the trees, and the soft turning of the world. Eventually he rises, turning down the lamp until only a faint glow remains. He walks through the house, the floor is cool under his feet, and pauses at the back door for one last look at the yard. The moonlight rests on the grass, the shadows of the lilacs lying still. Somewhere far away, so faint it could almost be imagined, there is the whisper of a train's horn. It carries no urgency, only the quiet assurance that it is out there, moving steadily through the night. Samuel smiles to himself, closes the door, and lets the house hold him for the rest of the evening. The rails will wait for tomorrow, and he will be there, ready for them as he always has been. Rooted in this place, steady in its rhythm, at peace with the passing of another day, morning arrives gently, the way a good neighbor might knock at your door, soft enough not to startle, steady enough to be heard. Samuel wakes to the pale light sliding across the floorboards, spilling in from the window at the foot of his bed. It is the kind of light that carries no urgency, just an invitation to join the day at one's own pace. He swings his legs over the side of the bed, feeling the coolness of the floor seep into his bare feet. The air in the room holds that fresh, faintly sweet scent that comes only at the edge of autumn, part earth, part leaf, part something you can't name but recognize all the same. Down in the kitchen, he fills the kettle and sets it on the stove. The faint tick of the burner warming brings a sense of steadiness, the first sound in a day that will grow slowly around him. As he waits, he steps out onto the back porch. The yard is touched with dew, each blade of grass bent under the weight of tiny beads of water. In the distance, the low fog clings to the fields, hiding the farthest fence lines and softening the shape of the hills. The kettle begins its whistle, low and gradual, and Samuel returns inside. He pours the hot water over the tea leaves in his mug, watching the color seep out into the water. It reminds him of watercolor paint spreading slowly across paper, soft at first, then deepening as it finds its way. He takes the first sip at the kitchen table, the steam brushing his face, and that's when he hears the sound of tires on the gravel drive. It's a sound he knows well, one that rarely comes before mid-morning and almost never without reason. Through the window he sees the small blue pickup belonging to Pete, the town's postman, pulling up beside the porch. Samuel steps to the door, opening it just as Pete makes his way up the steps with the small package in his hands. "Morning, Sam," Pete says with the easy familiarity of someone who's been greeting you for decades. "Got something here that came through the Lexington hub. Looks like it's been on the road a while." Samuel nods, accepting the package. The box is no bigger than a loaf of bread, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a length of twine. The handwriting on the label catches his eye. It's neat, careful, the letters curling slightly at the ends in a way that feels almost familiar. He thanks Pete, who tips his cap and heads back to the truck. He carries the package inside, setting it gently on the table. The twine is knotted simply, easy to undo. As he peels back the paper, the faint smell of cedar rises up, and he feels the corners of his mouth turn slightly at the memory of another cedar chest, the one in the spare room. Inside the box is a smaller parcel wrapped in cloth, and atop it, a folded note. The paper is thick, the kind used more often for letters than for anything practical. Samuel unfolds it, and the words settle into him slowly, as if they've been waiting for the right morning to arrive. "Dear Samuel, I found this while sorting through some of my mother's things. I thought it should be with you, where it belongs. She spoke often of the evenings she and Mary would sit at the depot together, waiting for you to arrive before the train came through. I hope this finds you well. Ellen Harrow." He knows the name. Ellen is the daughter of one of Mary's closest friends, a woman who had lived just 2 streets over in the early years of Samuel and Mary's marriage. He remembers her as a child with hair the color of chestnuts, sitting on the porch steps with a book too large for her hands. Samuel sets the note aside and unfolds the cloth. Inside is a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The image is black and white, its edges slightly faded, but the moment it holds is clear. Mary sits on the depot bench, her scarf tucked into her coat, her hands folded in her lap. The late afternoon light catches her face, and there's a softness in her expression that Samuel knows well. The look she reserved for quiet moments when she was content to simply be. He holds the frame for a long time, his thumb brushing lightly over the glass. The photograph is more than an image. It is a doorway, and stepping through it brings him the hum of the rails, the smell of the wooden platform, the way the air felt in the hour before the train arrived. He can almost hear her voice, low and even, speaking about something ordinary in a way that made it feel important. Setting the photograph on the table, Samuel feels no rush to move. The house is still, the light in the room warm and steady. He pours himself another cup of tea and takes the frame with him to the porch. Outside, the morning has lifted a little, the fog beginning to thin, the first hints of blue breaking through above the hills. He sits with the photograph propped against the arm of his chair, sipping his tea in the company of Mary's likeness. The tracks lie quiet in the distance, but he knows the train will come in its time, and when it does, he will be ready. For now, he simply lets the morning stretch out, each moment unspooling without hurry. The package, the note, the photograph, They have not changed the shape of his day, only deepened it. And as he sits there, the rails catching the first glint of sunlight, Samuel feels again that he is living in a place where the past and present keep each other company, holding him gently between them. The day passes slowly, as if it too has chosen to move in step with Samuel's thoughts. From his porch chair, he watches the light slide across the yard, changing the colors in small, patient increments, the green of the grass shifting toward the deep hue it takes on before night, the boards of the porch darkening under the slow retreat of the sun. The photograph of Mary rests on the table beside him, the simple wooden frame warm where the afternoon light touches it. Every so often his eyes return to it, not with the sharp ache of loss, but with the quiet acknowledgement of something still present. He has not decided to bring it to the depot this evening. Rather, the decision has made itself over the course of the day, settling into him like a certainty he does not need to question. In the early evening, Samuel rises, tucks the photograph carefully into the inside pocket of his coat, and begins the walk toward the depot. The air is clear and cool, the kind of air that carries sound further than usual. He can hear the faint murmur of conversation from a neighbor's porch 2 houses over, the soft clink of cutlery from a kitchen window left open to the breeze, the occasional bark of a dog farther down the street. The road to the depot feels familiar under his boots, every dip and curve known to him, every fence post a quiet marker of the way. At the edge of town, the open fields spread out to either side, their edges brushed with the low gold of the setting sun. A pair of crows lift from the ground near the tracks, their wings cutting dark shapes against the light. When he reaches the depot, the platform is empty, as it often is now. The boards give their soft, hollow sound under his step, and he takes his place on the bench. He sits back, his hands resting lightly in his lap, and feels the weight of the photograph against his chest. After a moment, he reaches into his coat, brings it out, and sets it beside him on the bench. The image catches the last of the sun, Mary's face lit with the pale glow that seems to blend with the light around them. Samuel turns slightly so he can see both her and the bend in the tracks where the train will first appear. It feels for this moment as though they are waiting together again. 2 figures sharing the same patch of worn wood, the same view, the same quiet expectation. The air carries the scent of the fields cooling under the evening, and somewhere beyond the depot, a wind stirs the tall grass into a slow ripple. The shadows lengthen, stretching across the platform until they meet the base of the bench. Samuel glances once more at Mary's photograph and then returns his gaze to the horizon. It begins the way it always does, with a faint vibration, the hum of something large and steady making its way closer. He feels it in the bench before he hears it, the wood picking up the low, rhythmic tremor from the rails. Then the sound grows, moving into the air around him, filling the quiet without, disturbing it. The whistle comes deep and familiar, carrying across the open land. It has the same tone it always has, but tonight, Samuel hears in it a thread of something gentler, as though the sound is shaped by the presence beside him. He imagines Mary lifting her head slightly at the whistle, the way she used to, her eyes narrowing against the setting sun as she searched for the first glimpse of the train. When it comes into view, the light of the engine catches the rails, turning them for a moment into a pair of molten lines. The cars follow, their sides glowing briefly before fading back into shadow. Samuel watches each one pass, his breathing matching the steady rhythm of the wheels. Beside him, the photograph remains still, But in his mind, Mary is there, leaning forward slightly, taking in the movement as she always did. The train passes the depot without slowing, the whistle sounding once more before it begins its gradual retreat into the distance. Samuel keeps his gaze on the bend until the last car is gone, the sound of the rails fading to a memory. The platform feels different in the moments after the train is passed, emptier in one way, fuller in another. He reaches for the photograph, holding it in both hands, and lets the quiet settle back around them. The light is nearly gone now, the sky deepening into blue, the first stars faint above the horizon. Samuel stays seated for a while longer, listening to the soft sounds of the evening, the crickets beginning their song, the whisper of the wind through the sycamores, the faint creak of the bench as he shifts his weight. When he finally stands, he slips the photograph back into his coat pocket. The walk home feels slower than the one here, as if the road itself is in no hurry to let go of the day. The air has cooled further, and the moon has begun its quiet climb above the hills. Back at the house, Samuel places the photograph on the small table by his chair, where the lamplight can reach it. He sits for a moment looking at it in the glow, before leaning back and closing his eyes. The sound of the train still lingers in him, steady and sure, like a heartbeat carried from the rails. And in that sound is the memory of her, familiar, enduring, and in its own way, still here. The house greets Samuel the way an old friend does, without fanfare, without the need for words, only the warmth of being known. He steps inside, closing the door softly behind him, and the familiar scents of wood, tea, and the faint trace of bread from the morning settle around him like a shawl. The lamplight in the front room pools gently on the floor, casting shadows that sway ever so slightly with the movement of the flame inside the glass chimney. He sets his coat on the peg by the door and reaches into the inside pocket, drawing out the photograph. For a moment he stands there, holding it in both hands, looking down at Mary's face as though she has just spoken, and he is considering how to reply. The lamplight touches the edges of the frame, making the wood's grain glow softly. He carries it to the small table beside his armchair, placing it so that from where he sits, it will be at eye level. The evening air has cooled noticeably since his walk home. He leaves the back door open just a little, enough to let in the faint, steady chorus of crickets and the occasional creak of the porch settling as the night air wraps around it. From somewhere far off, he thinks he hears the muted rush of the train's passage in another town down the line, faint enough that it could be mistaken for the wind in the trees, but distinct enough for him to know it's there. He moves to the kitchen, sets the kettle on the stove, and stands leaning against the counter while it heats. This is a rhythm he's repeated so many times that it feels almost like breathing. The kettle's low hum, the slow curl of steam before the whistle, the measured pour over the tea leaves. Tonight he chooses the same mug he's used for years, the one with a tiny chip at the rim that somehow never catches on his lips. Back in the front room, he settles into his armchair with the tea, the cushion sighing quietly under his weight. The photograph is to his right, catching a glint of lamplight. He takes a slow sip, the warmth of the tea moving through him, grounding him in the present, even as the edges of his mind wander to the past. Through the open door, the yard is lit by a near full moon. Its light silver washes the grass and turns the leaves of the lilac bush into coins of pale green. The shadows it casts are longer and softer than those of the sun, reaching farther into the corners of the yard. Every so often, a firefly drifts into view, its glow dim compared to the moon's, but insistent in its own small way. The house holds a stillness that is never empty. It has its own quiet voice, the faint groan of the floorboards, the occasional sigh of wind against the siding, the steady heartbeat of the clock on the wall. Samuel listens without strain, letting the sounds wash over him. They are the same sounds Mary once heard in this room, the same walls, the same lamplight, the same slow drift toward night. His gaze returns to the photograph. He wonders how many evenings she had sat in that very place at the depot, waiting with the same patience he now carries. It is easy to imagine her in the chair across from him now, feet tucked beneath her, a book in her lap. He doesn't try to force the image into sharpness. He lets it come and go as it wishes, like a breeze through an open window. He finishes his tea slowly, the mug growing lighter in his hands, the heat fading but leaving behind a lingering comfort. On the table beside him is a book he's been reading for weeks. He opens it not to push forward with the story, but to let the words run gently over his mind. After a few pages, he closes it again, satisfied in the way one is after a familiar meal. Not because of surprise, but because of nourishment. The clock chimes once, marking the hour. Samuel looks toward the window. The moon has climbed higher, and the stars around it seem sharper now, as though the air has cleared further. The crickets continue without pause, and somewhere out beyond the hills, a dog gives a single bark before falling silent again. He leans back in the chair, the photograph still in view, the lamplight soft against the walls. The day has folded itself neatly into the night, each hour tucked in behind the other. Nothing in the room feels urgent. Nothing asks for more than he can give. He reaches forward to turn down the lamp, letting the glow dim until the room is bathed mostly in the silver of the moon. The photograph takes on a different quality in this light, less a picture, more a memory resting in the open air between them. He sits for a long time in that half-light, his breathing steady, the sounds of the night threading through the open door. When he finally stands, it is not because the moment has ended, but because he chooses to carry it with him into the rest of the night. He picks up the photograph, holding it close, and makes his way to the bedroom. Setting it on the table beside the bed, he lets the moonlight fall across it one last time before turning back the covers. The quiet gathers around him as he lies down, the cool sheets welcoming him. Outside, the night holds steady as though keeping watch. Somewhere along the rails, whether near or far, another train moves through the dark, its sound softened by distance, its rhythm as sure as a heartbeat. Samuel closes his eyes, feeling the day ease away, leaving only the simple comfort of knowing he will rise again to another morning, another evening, another passing of the train at dusk. And with that thought, sleep comes to him gently, like the moonlight itself spilling quietly into the room. Morning comes quietly to Samuel's house, not with the rush of daylight pouring in all at once, but in the slow, steady way that feels right for this place. The first light filters through the thin curtains in the bedroom, soft and silver-tinged, carrying with it the faintest scent of dew on grass. The air holds the cool of night still, though there is already a promise of warmth in the day ahead. Samuel wakes in stages. At first, it's just the awareness of being in his own bed, the familiar weight of the quilt, the gentle sound of the clock in the front room marking each second. Then comes the sound of a mourning dove outside, its call low and drawn out, and the small creak of the floorboard near the window as the wood adjusts to the change in temperature. He doesn't hurry to rise. Instead, he lies there a while longer, listening. The morning in this town is a quiet thing. No honking of car horns, no constant hum of traffic, only the measured life of a place that has never tried to be more than it is. Somewhere down the street, a screen door closes, the sound carrying in the still air. It could be Mrs. Porter letting her cat out, or old Mr. Hanley stepping onto his porch to read the morning paper. These small rituals belong to the town as much as the hills and the river. When he finally does sit up, he glances to the nightstand. The photograph of Mary rests where he placed it last night, the edge of the frame kissed by the pale morning light. He touches the top of the frame lightly, a gesture more habit than thought, before swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The kitchen greets him with its own kind of morning stillness. The kettle sits where we left it, ready for another day's work. He fills it with fresh water from the pump at the sink, the sound of the stream echoing faintly in the quiet. Outside, a faint mist lingers low over the fields, drifting in slow ribbons that dissolve as the sun gains its strength. With tea in hand, he steps out onto the porch. The boards are cool under his feet, and the air smells of damp earth and the faint sweetness of lilac from the bush by the fence. The sky is a pale blue washed clean by the night, and the hills in the distance still wear the last traces of shadow along their ridges. The town begins its day with unhurried certainty. A figure pedals by on a bicycle, the faint whir of the wheels cutting gently through the morning air. Down near the corner, the bakery's front door opens, releasing the warm scent of bread into the street. Samuel closes his eyes for a moment, breathing it in. It's a scent that carries memory of mornings when Mary would come home from the bakery with a loaf still warm, wrapped in brown paper, and they would sit at the table together before the day's work began. He finishes his tea slowly, then walks down the steps into the yard. The grass is cool with dew, each blade tipped with a drop of light. A few birds dart through the air above, their wings catching the sun. He takes the narrow path toward the edge of town, where the old sycamore tree stands near the tracks. The sycamore has been there longer than Samuel can remember, its branches broad and layered with leaves that whisper in the slightest breeze. Beneath it, the ground is worn smooth in places from years of feet passing by. Children playing, farmers heading to the depot, couples pausing for a moment on their evening walks. Samuel has passed this way so many times that each bend in the path feels like a memory in itself. When he reaches the tracks, the metal rails glint in the morning light, still cool from the night air. He rests a hand lightly on one, feeling the faint echo of the world it connects to, places he has never been, mornings that belong to other towns. In the stillness, he remembers a winter morning many years ago, when the snow lay deep and unbroken along these same rails. It had been just after New Year's. The sky that day was a clean, cold blue, the air sharp enough to make each breath visible. Mary had walked with him to the depot, their boots crunching in the snow. She had carried a basket with 2 jars of preserves wrapped in cloth, a gift for her sister in the next county over. They had stood together on the platform, waiting for the train that would carry the basket away. He remembers the way her cheeks had been flushed from the cold, her breath curling in the air, the way she had tucked her hand into his without a word. The train had come, its engine sending up a plume of steam that drifted into the clear morning. He had helped her hand the basket to the conductor, and they had watched it vanish into the car. But what he remembers most is not the train or the snow or even the basket. It is the sound of her laughter as they walked home. the way it seemed to wrap around them like a scarf against the cold. Now, standing here in the spring light, the memory feels as present as the rails beneath his hand. The winter morning is gone, but its warmth remains. He stays there a while longer, letting the past and present rest easily together, without the need to separate them. When he finally turns back toward town, the sun is higher, and the mist has lifted from the fields. The air feels lighter, as if the day has fully settled into itself. He takes the long way home, past the bakery again, where the smell of bread still lingers in the doorway. A small boy stands outside with a paper bag, holding it close to his chest as if guarding something precious. Samuel smiles at him in passing, and the boy grins back, crumbs already at the corner of his mouth. Back at the house, the porch waits in the same quiet way it always does. Samuel steps inside, setting the kettle on the stove again, not because he needs more tea, but because the act itself is part of the day's rhythm. As the water begins to heat, he glances once more at Mary's photograph. Outside, the town moves on with its morning, slow and steady, untroubled, and somewhere beyond the hills, on a line he cannot see from here, a train is making its way through the day, as it always has, carrying with it the echo of all the mornings it has passed through before. By the time the sun has begun its slow climb toward the middle of the sky, the air in Samuel's kitchen is already warm with the quiet labor of the day. The kettle has been used twice more since morning, once for tea, once for the hot water. He poured over the sink to loosen the jar lid that had stuck the night before. Outside, a breeze stirs the lilac bush, scattering the scent across the porch and into the open kitchen window. It is in the middle of this unhurried rhythm that the knock comes, gentle, not urgent, more a polite announcement of someone standing at the door than a call to be answered quickly. Samuel wipes his hands on the towel draped over the back of a chair and walks to the front door. When he opens it, the postman is there, a man Samuel has known for years, his face weathered by wind and sun. "Morning, Samuel," the postman says, handing over a small bundle of mail. It's the usual, a folded town bulletin, a thin envelope from the electric company, and beneath them, an envelope that makes Samuel pause. The paper is thicker than most, with the faint yellowing of age at the edges. The address is written in a careful, slanted hand he hasn't seen in years, one that once sent postcards from far-off places full of small details about streets and gardens Samuel had never walked. He thanks the postman, who tips his cap and moves on down the street, leaving Samuel standing there on the porch with the letter in his hands. He carries it inside and sets it on the table, making himself another cup of tea before he sits down. The steam curls upward as he studies the envelope, letting the weight of it settle in his hands before sliding a finger under the flap. The paper inside unfolds with a faint crackle, and the words begin as if no time at all has passed. "Dear Samuel, it's been far too long since I've written. I imagine the sycamore is still standing by the tracks, and the lilacs by your porch still bloom in spring. I wonder if you still walk down to the depot some evenings, just to see the trains pass. I thought of you last week when I heard one in the distance here. It carried me straight back to those summer nights in our town, and I felt for a moment as if I'd never left." The signature at the bottom is from Thomas, an old friend who had left the town decades ago, following work in a city Samuel never visited. They had been boys together, sharing fishing poles and secret spots along the riverbank, and later young men swapping stories in the depot's waiting room on quiet evenings. Thomas had written often in the early years after he moved, But the letters had grown fewer, the intervals longer. Samuel reads the letter twice, letting the voice in the words settle into his mind. Thomas writes of a small garden he tends now, tucked behind an apartment building, and of how the sound of trains still reaches him at dusk if the wind is right. He asks about the town, about people whose names have not been spoken aloud in years, about places that have changed and others that remain stubbornly the same. When he finishes, Samuel sits for a while in the stillness of the kitchen. Through the window, he can see the soft sway of the lilac bush, and beyond it, the quiet stretch of road leading toward the depot. The letter lies open on the table, the sunlight moving slowly across it as the day advances. He thinks about the last time he saw Thomas, the two of them sitting on the bench outside the bakery in late summer. They had eaten fresh rolls warm from the oven and talked about nothing in particular, about the weather, about a stray cat that had been making the rounds in town, about the train that was due in just before dark. There had been no farewell that day, only the casual assumption that there would always be another bench, another roll, another evening to share. Later that afternoon, Samuel walks to the small desk in the corner of the front room. He takes out a sheet of paper and uncaps his pen, the one with a nib worn smooth from years of letters and notes. He begins slowly, shaping each word with care. Dear Thomas, your letter found me well. The sycamore still stands by the tracks, and the lilacs bloom as you remembered. I still walk to the depot some evenings, though not as often as I once did. The trains come and go, and each one feels like a familiar chapter in a book I've read many times before. He writes for a long while, describing the town in its quiet season, the way the hills look in the early morning light, the way the air feels just before rain. He tells Thomas about the bakery, about the boy who sometimes waits outside with the paper bag of bread, about Mrs. Porter's cat who now spends most afternoons sunning itself on the fence. When the letter is finished, he folds it carefully and places it in an envelope, sealing it with a firm press of his fingers. Tomorrow, he will walk it down to the post office himself, past the sycamore and along the tracks where the train sometimes passes in the distance, carrying with it the faint echo of other towns, other mornings, other friends. As the afternoon deepens, Samuel returns to the porch with his tea. The sun lies low enough now that the shadows are stretching long across the yard. In the quiet, he imagines Thomas in his garden, hearing the faint sound of a train at dusk, and he feels the thin but steady thread that still connects them across all the years and miles. The breeze carries the scent of lilac again, and Samuel leans back in his chair, letting it linger. Somewhere, not too far off, he hears the faint whistle of a train, and for a moment, it feels as if the distance between here and there has almost vanished. The next morning arrives with a pale, milky light, the kind that softens every edge and blurs the line between sky and horizon. Samuel wakes to the quiet hum of a day not yet begun, the air in the room cool enough that he pulls the quilt a little tighter before rising. In the kitchen, the kettle sings its slow, familiar tune, and soon he is cradling a mug of tea between his hands, the steam lifting into the dim air. On the table beside him lies the envelope he sealed the day before, his reply to Thomas. The paper inside still holds the warmth of his thoughts, the quiet weight of what he wanted to share. It is strange, he thinks, how a letter can seem both small and heavy at the same time. Small enough to slip into a coat pocket, yet heavy enough to carry decades of memory. By mid-morning, the light outside has settled into a clearer tone, and the town has begun its unhurried rhythm. Samuel steps out onto the porch with the letter tucked into his jacket, closing the door gently behind him. The boards underfoot creak in the same way they always have, and he makes a mental note, though he knows he won't act on it, to tighten the loose nails when he has the time. The walk to the post office is not a long one, but Samuel takes it slowly. The air carries a freshness that hints at the possibility of rain later, though the clouds are only faint smudges along the far hills for now. He passes the bakery, its door propped open to let the warm scent of bread roll into the street. Inside, he catches sight of Mrs. Larkin arranging loaves on a shelf, her movements unhurried, her posture as steady as the old counter she stands behind. Further along, he passes the schoolyard. The children are inside at their lessons, but he can hear the muffled sound of recitation through the open windows. A low, steady chant of young voices repeating lines in unison. It's a sound that belongs to the heartbeat of the town, always there in some form, in every season. When he reaches the post office, the bell above the door gives its soft, almost shy ring as he steps inside. The air smells faintly of papers and ink, with a trace of the oiled wood from the counter. Mr. Green, the postmaster, looks up from his ledger with a nod. "Morning, Samuel," he says, his voice carrying the weight of routine. "Morning," Samuel replies, sliding the letter across the counter. "Off to the city," he adds, though both of them know the address is written clear enough on the envelope. Mr. Green takes it with care, setting it in a wooden tray with the others bound for the train that will pass through later in the day. For a moment, Samuel imagines that letter making its way down the line, through towns both larger and smaller than this one, until it finds its way into Thomas's hands. He leaves the post office and begins the walk home, but instead of taking the direct route, he turns down a side street lined with old maples, their leaves just beginning to show the faintest edges of gold, stirred gently in the breeze. The street leads toward the edge of town, where the houses give way to a stretch of open ground that runs alongside the tracks. It's here, as he walks, that Samuel feels the tug of an old memory, one he hasn't touched in some time. He stops beside a weathered fence post, resting a hand on the smooth top, and lets the scene unfold in his mind. It had been a day much like this, many years ago, when Mary was still alive and autumn was just beginning to lay its colors across the hills. They had walked together from the house to the tracks, carrying a small wicker basket between them. Inside were apples wrapped in cloth to keep them from bruising, and a jar of honey they had promised to send to Mary's cousin in the next county. The train that afternoon had been late, the sun already low enough to throw long shadows across the rails by the time it came. Samuel remembers how Mary had leaned against the fence, her hair caught by the wind, her eyes following the horizon as if she could see the train before it appeared. When it finally came into view, the low whistle drifting ahead of it, she had smiled. Not the quick smile she gave to neighbors passing on the street, but the slow, deep one that seemed to hold the whole moment inside it. They had watched the conductor stow the basket in the freight car, and then, as the train pulled away, they'd stayed there for a while longer, listening to the sound fade into the distance. Neither of them had been in a hurry to leave. The light had turned more golden with each passing minute, the air carrying the scent of leaves that had already fallen somewhere further up the valley. Now, standing in the same place, Samuel can almost hear that whistle again. The air feels the same, gentle with a hint of change, and for a brief moment, the years between then and now seem to fold in on themselves. He lingers there until the breeze shifts, carrying with it the faint sound of the town, the hum of a truck engine somewhere near the main road, the distant bark of a dog. Then he turns back toward home, following the path along the fence until it meets the road again. By the time he reaches his porch, the clouds on the horizon have thickened, softening the light that falls across the yard. He steps inside, hanging his jacket on a hook by the door, and glances once more at the photograph of Mary on the shelf. It feels somehow like she has been near today, not in any grand, unexplainable way, but in the quiet sense that the air itself has carried her memory closer. He makes another pot of tea as the first drops of rain begin to tap gently against the window. The sound mingles with the rhythm of the clock in the front room, steady and sure. Samuel settles into his chair by the window, the cup warm in his hands, and watches as the rain thickens into a soft curtain across the yard. Somewhere, not too far off, he knows the afternoon train is making its way down the line, carrying mail and apples and perhaps, somewhere in its cargo, the weight of someone else's memory. The rain came in a steady rhythm that afternoon, a kind that was neither hurried nor loud, but sure in its fall, as though it had been descending in the same patient pattern for years. From his chair by the window, Samuel could see the drops breaking against the porch rail, forming small rivulets that slid down to the steps, each one catching a glimmer of light from the gray sky. The sound filled the house the way a familiar voice fills a room, not imposing, not demanding, but present enough to settle into. It softened the edges of the day, the way rain always did here, drawing the world inward. Outside, the yard was washed in muted tones, the grass deepening in color, the sycamore leaves trembling under the weight of water before releasing it in slow, deliberate drips. Samuel leaned back, his hands wrapped loosely around his mug, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. The steam rose slowly, curling into the cool air of the room. It was the kind of afternoon that asked nothing of a man but to sit and notice, to be part of the quiet without disturbing it. The steady curtain of rain against the yard stirred something in him, drawing up an image from long ago, when the lines on his hands were fewer and his step was quicker. He had been a young man then, still learning the ways of the land, still feeling the pull between where he was and where he might go. It was late summer, the kind that was heavy with warmth, though a storm had been rolling in from the west. Samuel had been at the edge of the field, mending a section of fence, when the first drops began to fall. He remembered how the air had smelled, rich and earthy, the scent of damp soil rising even before the rain truly began. By the time he reached the road, the storm had settled in, and the light had taken on that strange, beautiful quality that comes when rain falls under a fading sun. He had followed the sound of the whistle then, curious, drawn more by instinct than by purpose, until he found himself near the small depot at the edge of town. It was there, under the shelter of the overhang, that he had first spoken with Mr. Henry, the station master. The man had been leaning on the counter, his hat pushed back on his head, watching the rain blur the tracks into faint silver lines. "You came for the train?" Henry had asked, not unkindly. "Not really," Samuel had said, "just follow the sound." Henry had nodded as if that were reason enough. Sometimes that's all you need. The train had arrived just as the rain eased, its approach steady, the whistle low and resonant. Samuel remembered the way the wheels threw up small sprays of water from the rails, the way the light from the engine cut through the mist. There had been only a handful of passengers stepping down that day. One of them, a woman in a pale dress who had paused at the edge of the platform, to look back down the line, as though she were leaving something behind. Samuel had not spoken to her, nor she to him, but for some reason, that moment stayed with him. The sight of her standing still while the world moved around her, the rain softening the air between them. He had thought about her more than once in the years that followed, not with longing, but with a quiet curiosity about the lives we cross without ever truly entering. Back in the present, Samuel sipped his tea, the warmth lingering on his tongue. The rain outside showed no sign of letting up, and he felt no need for it to. In its steady presence, he could hear echoes of every storm he had known in this place. The summer showers that cooled the heat, the autumn rains that softened the fields for planting, the winter sleet that rattled against the windows like a small, insistent knock. He let his gaze drift from the yard to the narrow strip of road beyond, empty now except for the glistening puddles that reflected the sky. Somewhere further down that road lay the bend in the tracks where the train would appear this evening, just as it always did, no matter the weather. He imagined it cutting through the rain, its whistle low and certain, a sound that belonged to both the present and the past. In a little while he knew he might put on his coat and walk to the depot again, or he might stay here, letting the sound of the rain and the faint vibration of the passing train reach him where he sat. Either way, it would come, carrying with it the hum of distance and the small, unspoken connections between strangers. The light in the room shifted as the afternoon wore on, the gray deepening toward blue. Samuel reached for the small lamp on the table, its glow casting a warm circle on the wood. He set his mug down and leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. The rain, the train, the memory of that woman on the platform, they wove together into something soft and whole, a fabric of moments that needed no stitching to hold. And as the sound of the rain filled the room again, Samuel felt himself sink deeper into the chair, the quiet steadying him in a way words never could. The rain had settled into a softer pattern by the time Samuel decided to put on his coat. The earlier steady downpour had given way to a fine silvery mist that drifted through the air like breath in winter. It beaded on the sleeves of his jacket and dampened the brim of his hat, but it was the sort of rain that asked more to be noticed than endured. He closed the door gently behind him, slipping the key into his pocket, and stepped onto the porch. The boards under his feet creaked in their familiar way, a sound that had never changed in all the years he'd lived here. The scent of wet earth and lilac met him immediately, mingling with the faint mineral tang that always followed a long rain. The road to the depot was not far, but Samuel never hurried it, especially on evenings like this, when the air seemed to slow everything down. He took each step as if it were part of a measured rhythm. The soft scuff of his boots, the whisper of water in the roadside ditch, the occasional tap of a droplet slipping from a sycamore leaf onto his hat brim. The sky was shifting toward twilight, though the clouds softened the change, stretching the light into something diffuse and lingering. The lamplight in the windows of the few houses he passed glowed warmly against the gray, hinting at suppers being prepared, at quiet conversations unfolding behind half-drawn curtains. When Samuel reached the bend where the road dipped toward the tracks, he paused for a moment. The depot was just visible through the veil of mist, its roof darkened by rain, the windows reflecting the muted light of the sky. From here, he could already see the station lamp lit at the edge of the platform, its pale gold halo cast into the damp air. He crossed the last stretch slowly, his boots finding the familiar worn boards of the platform. The air smelled faintly of oil and old wood, and the sound of water dripping from the eaves kept time with the hush of the mist. Mr. Henry was there, leaning in the doorway of the station office, his hat low over his brow. "Evening, Samuel," Henry said, his voice easy and unhurried. "Evening," Samuel replied, lifting a hand in greeting. They didn't speak further right away. There was a kind of understanding between them that words could interrupt, and so they stood in companionable silence, both watching the line of track vanish into the soft blur of rain and distance. Somewhere out there, the train would already be making its approach, steady, inevitable as it always was. Samuel rested his hands on the railing, his eyes tracing the faint gleam of the wet rails. He thought of how many evenings he had stood in this very spot, the seasons changing around him, but the ritual remaining the same. There was something deeply comforting in that, the knowing that some things could be counted on without question. Then, faint at first but certain, came the sound, a low rolling hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself, growing with each passing second. It was followed by the distant call of the whistle, long and mellow, carrying through the damp air like a familiar note in a long song. The light appeared next, a small, steady glow cutting through the mist. It grew slowly, the hum deepening into the soft rhythm of wheels on rails. Samuel felt the vibration through the boards under his feet, that quiet shiver of connection between the train and the land it crossed. When it arrived, the train moved with the quiet assurance of something that had no need to announce itself. The rain streaked along its sides, and in the lit window Samuel caught glimpses of faces, some turned toward books or letters, some looking out into the mist without really seeing. One window passed where a young woman sat with her head against the glass, her eyes half closed, her expression unreadable. Another showed an older man in a dark coat, his gaze fixed on the folded newspaper in his lap. Each moment was brief, gone in the space of a heartbeat, yet each seemed to carry the whole of a life in that small frame of view. The train's passing was not fast. It lingered enough for Samuel to take it in, but soon it had moved beyond the platform, its light softening into the rain ahead, its whistle sounding again as it rounded the bend toward the open fields. The sound faded gradually, as if it were being drawn away into another world. Samuel stood for a while longer, looking down the tracks where the mist had already begun to close in again. Beside him, Henry shifted slightly, the wood creaking under his boots. "Same as ever," Henry said, not without a note of quiet satisfaction. "Same as ever," Samuel agreed. He turned to head home, the walk back lit by the first faint glimmers of evening lamps in the houses he passed. The rain still drifted down, touching the brim of his hat, but it no longer felt like weather to be noticed. It was simply part of the air, as familiar and untroubling as his own breath. When he reached his porch again, he paused before going inside. The sycamore at the edge of the yard stood dark against the silver-gray sky, its leaves holding droplets that caught the lamplight from the window. Somewhere in the distance, though faint now, he thought he could still hear the last echo of the train's whistle, carrying the dusk into night. By the time Samuel stepped back into the house, the day had settled into that in-between quiet that rests gently between dusk and nightfall. The air inside was warmer than outside, holding the faint scent of bread from earlier in the day, and the soft woody smell that came from the old floorboards after rain. He hung his coat on its peg by the door, set his hat on the small table, and stood for a moment letting the silence wrap around him. The window in the front room called to him in that way it sometimes did on evenings like this. He filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and struck a match to light the small blue flame beneath it. While it warmed, he moved to the low bookshelf in the corner and took down an old tin of loose tea, the same brand he and Mary had favored for years. The tin had a small dent in one side, a reminder of the day it had slipped from his hand while they were unpacking groceries together, and she had laughed at the way it rolled halfway across the kitchen before stopping against the leg of the table. When the kettle began its soft, rising hum, Samuel poured the steaming water into his mug, watching the leaves curl and darken. He carried it to the chair by the window, the one with the cushion just slightly flattened from years of use. The glass was cool to the touch, and beyond it, the rain still drifted down in silver threads, blurring the lamplight from the houses across the street. He could still hear it, the train's whistle, not in any real present sound, but in the way his mind held onto it. It lingered the way a story does after it's told, carrying with it all the weight of memory and the gentle ache of something beloved and gone. He thought again of the young woman in the passing window. Her head leaned against the glass, and wondered if she was still riding, miles away by now, into a night where she might be watching a different kind of rainfall. The tea was just the right temperature when he took his first sip, the warmth seeping through him in a slow, steady way. Outside, the sycamore swayed slightly, its branches shedding a few droplets at a time. Each one landed with a soft patter on the porch roof, a sound that seemed to fold itself into the steady ticking of the clock behind him. It was at moments like this, alone yet not lonely, that Samuel felt most in touch with the quiet truth of his life. The world beyond his porch could be vast and full of motion, trains rushing toward unseen destinations, seasons shifting with their own unhurried authority. But here, in the small circle of his own home, the pace was his to keep. His gaze wandered across the room, pausing at the small mantel where a framed photograph of Mary rested. It had been taken on a spring afternoon long ago, when they'd taken a picnic to the edge of the orchard. In the picture, her hair was caught by the wind, and she was looking at him with an expression that still made him feel, even now, as if he were the only person in the world who mattered to her. He thought of how many evenings she had sat across from him at this very window, their mugs of tea warming their hands, watching the same rain that now traced its way down the glass. He set the mug down and leaned back, letting his eyes rest half-closed. The rain filled the spaces between his thoughts, soft and steady, like the quiet pages of a well-worn book being turned. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. In that drowsy space between waking and sleep, Samuel let the edges of his mind drift. He pictured the depot bench, the way the worn boards curved slightly in the middle from years of waiting. He imagined her sitting there again, scarf tucked under her chin, watching for him as if no time at all had passed. In his mind, he walked toward her, boots tapping softly on the platform, the sound of the approaching train growing behind him. She would stand as he came close, her smile as familiar as the sound of his own name, and together they would turn to watch the light round the bend. The whistle called again, faint, imaginary, but as clear to him as the scent of her hair on the breeze, and he breathed in slowly, letting the moment linger. The tea cooled in his mug. The rain thinned until it was no more than a fine mist, and Samuel, wrapped in the layered comfort of the present and the past, let his thoughts quiet entirely. The night would come fully soon enough, bringing with it the stillness that he welcomed, the kind that asked for nothing and gave only rest. Somewhere in that quiet, he thought, Mary would be smiling. The memory returned to Samuel, the way the scent of lilacs drifts into an open window, unexpected, soft, and somehow already familiar. It was many years ago, though the details felt close enough to touch. He had been the young man then, not yet worn by time, carrying the restless energy of someone whose life still stretched far out ahead. Mary had been there, her hair gathered back loosely with the few wind-blown strands catching the gold light of early evening. It was late spring, the kind of day when the air feels light but carries a quiet promise of the warmth to come. They had been walking from her father's house toward the edge of town, a wicker picnic basket swinging from his hand. She'd insisted they go to the tracks to watch the evening train, not because either of them had anywhere to travel, but because she liked the way the sky looked just before it arrived. The path to the tracks wound past the mill pond, where frogs were already singing their low, contented chorus. Willows leaned toward the water, their reflections trembling with the ripple of a soft breeze. Mary had paused there, resting her hand on the rough wood of the fence, looking at the pond as if it were an old friend she hadn't seen in a while. He remembered the way she smiled, not at him, but into the moment itself, as though the air and the light and the sound of the frogs had conspired to make her heart lighter. They'd reached the depot a little before dusk. It wasn't much, a weathered platform, a bench with peeling paint, and a sign whose letters had faded under years of sun. The station master, an older man with a deep-lined face and a slow gait, tipped his hat to them as they passed. No one else was there, just the two of them, and the scent of lilacs drifting from somewhere unseen. Mary had sat on the bench, her skirt brushing lightly against the boards and padded the space beside her. "You can hear it before you see it," she'd said, tilting her head slightly, listening. Samuel had tried to catch the sound she meant, but all he could hear at first was the faint hum of insects and the distant bark of a dog. Then, slowly, it came, the low, steady rhythm of steel on steel, carried across the fields like a heartbeat growing closer. The light had changed by then. The sky deepened into a soft gradient of rose and violet, and the first faint stars began to tremble overhead. Mary's face, turned toward the sound, was calm in a way that made him think of deep water, still on the surface but holding quiet depths below. When the train appeared, rounding the bend in the distance, the light caught its windows so they shone like small lanterns moving through the dusk. Samuel had felt something stir in him then, though he couldn't have named it, some blend of wonder and longing and the simple recognition of being alive in a moment that felt entirely whole. The train passed without stopping, its whistle trailing behind like a ribbon of sound unraveling. Into the evening, Mary had watched it go, her eyes following until the last faint glimmer of light slipped into the distance. Then she'd turned to him, her smile warm but touched with that gentle sadness that sometimes comes at the end of beautiful things. They'd stayed on the bench a while longer, letting the night settle in around them. Fireflies began to appear along the edge of the platform, their brief golden sparks rising and fading like the small unspoken thoughts that pass between two people who don't need to speak. When they finally stood to leave, the air had cooled just enough for her to draw her shawl tighter around her shoulders. He'd taken the basket in one hand and offered her the other, and they'd walked back along the path in easy silence, their footsteps in rhythm with each other. In the years that followed, Samuel and Mary had watched many more trains pass at dusk. Some evenings they would talk about the day, their words drifting lazily between them like the slow current of the creek. Other times they would sit without speaking, sharing the quiet as though it were a language only they understood. But that first evening, the lilacs, the frogs, the first glow of the train rounding the bend had a way of returning to him when the house was still, and the rain tapped gently at the windows. Sitting now in his chair by the window, the rain misting down beyond the glass, Samuel let the memory wash over him in unhurried waves. It wasn't just a recollection, it was a place he could step into whenever the night felt too empty. And as he sat there, with the faint echo of the train's whistle lingering in his mind, he felt again the simple, unshakable truth of that long ago evening, that life in its quietest moments could be more than enough. The sound that brought Samuel back from his drifting thoughts was not loud nor sharp, but it was enough to break the thin veil of memory. It was the soft creak of the front porch step, the one just beyond the threshold, which had always groaned a little under weight. At first, he thought it might have been the wind pressing against the wood in just the right way, but the rhythm of it felt more deliberate, like someone shifting their stance while pausing before the door. He didn't turn right away. Instead, he let the sound settle into the room, mingling with the faint patter of rain against the window. He had learned long ago that moments like these, when something interrupts the ordinary quiet, are best met with stillness. Sometimes when you wait, the truth of it reveals itself. Mary used to do that, step onto the porch without calling out, letting the screen door hum faintly in its frame before she entered. He would hear that creak and know she was there, her hands full of something from the garden or her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders. Even now, years later, the memory of that small sound could bring her presence into the room as clearly as if she had just set her basket on the table. Samuel rose from his chair slowly, his joints reminding him of the years, and crossed to the window that overlooked the porch. There was nothing there but the rain-darkened boards and the faint shimmer of water pooling in the grooves between them. The step looked the same as it had for decades, weathered gray wood, worn smooth in the middle from years of feet crossing over it. And yet, standing there, he could almost see her shoes, practical leather ones in early spring, soft slippers in the cooler months. Pausing on that step before the door opened, he stayed by the window for a while, watching the rain trace lines down the glass. Beyond the porch, the road was quiet, its surface reflecting the dim amber light from the street lamp at the corner. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then fell silent. A train wouldn't pass for another hour, maybe more. The world seemed to be holding its breath in the pause between day and night. When Samuel finally turned back to the room, he noticed how the lamplight pooled gently across the table, catching on the worn curve of Mary's old teacup. He hadn't used it in years, afraid perhaps that it might chip, or that using it too often would somehow thin the memory of her holding it. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't name, he felt the quiet urge to take it from its place on the shelf. The cup was lighter than he remembered, the porcelain thin enough to let the light glow faintly through. He set it on the table and filled it with hot water, letting the steam curl upward and carry the scent of chamomile into the air. Mary had always kept a small jar of dried blossoms for evenings when the day had worn her thin. She'd say the tea didn't just warm the body, it settled the mind, as though each sip carried away some of the heaviness. He sat again by the window, the cup warming his hands. The rain had softened to a mist, and the street lamp's glow blurred slightly in the damp air. He found himself listening, not for the train yet, but for the small, almost imperceptible sounds that fill a quiet house at night. The faint tick of the clock in the hallway, the settling sigh of the wooden beams, the whisper of wind against the eaves. It was in moments like this that Samuel felt closest to her, not in the grand anniversaries or the photographs in their frames, but in the ordinary rhythms they had once shared without thought. A cup of tea in the same old chair, the smell of rain on the porch, the creak of a step that never quite stopped speaking. And as he sipped, letting the warmth spread slowly through her, he realized that the porch step had not been a trick of the weather at all. It had been a reminder, gentle and unhurried, that some presences don't vanish, they just find quieter ways to return. He smiled faintly, setting the cup down with care. Somewhere down the line the train would pass, carrying its light and sound into the dusk. But for now, the evening was enough. The steady rain, the memory of her hand resting on his, and the quiet knowledge that love, once planted deep, has a way of blooming again in the smallest corners of a life. The rain had eased into a thin, silvery drizzle by the time Samuel noticed a distant hum in the air. It was the kind of sound that didn't arrive all at once, but crept in quietly, like the slow lifting of a curtain. Out beyond the field, somewhere past the curve of the river and the low line of maples, the evening train was beginning its approach. He set his cup down on the table, not because he was finished with it, but because he wanted both hands free to lean against the window frame. There was something in the sound of that train, a low, steady rhythm that seemed to pull the evening into focus. It had been like that for as long as he could remember, even in his younger years, when his days were fuller and his steps were quicker. The trains passing at dusk had a way of making him pause, as though it was reminding him that each day carried its own kind of arrival and departure. Tonight the sound stirred more than just the present moment. As the faint metallic rumble began to thread through the mist, a memory surfaced, one Samuel had not visited in many seasons. It was of a night long ago when he had stood on this very porch, a much younger man, and heard the same train calling from the distance. Only then he had been waiting for news. It had been a summer of heavy heat, the kind that pressed down on the land until even the air felt tired. Mary had been away, visiting her sister in the next county, and he had been working the farm alone. The days had been long, but it wasn't the work that had worn on him, it was the waiting. They had been apart before, but that summer felt different. There had been talk of opportunities in a larger town, places where the roads ran busier and the wages came more steadily. Mary had written to him about it in careful, even words, not pushing, but opening the thought like a small, folded letter she wasn't sure he would want to read. He remembered standing on the porch that evening, hands in his pockets, the smell of dust rising from the fields after a brief, passing rain. The train was due any minute, and with it, the letter she had said she would send. He had no way of knowing what her answer would be, whether she wanted to stay in this slow, familiar place, or take the risk of beginning somewhere new. When the train finally passed, its lights brushing briefly against the edges of the town, he had watched as the station agent carried a small stack of mail to the post office across the street. Among those envelopes had been hers. It was a simple letter, as it turned out. She wrote that she would follow his choice, whether it led them deeper into these quiet hills or onto streets lined with strangers. But she ended with a single sentence that anchored itself in him, so deep that even now, decades later, he could hear her voice in the shape of each word. "Wherever we are, Samuel, I only want to arrive there with you." They had stayed, of course, chosen the fields, the porch, the familiar sound of the train moving past without stopping. He had wondered now and then what might have happened if they'd gone, but in the years since he'd come to understand that the true turning points of a life aren't always about where you go. They're about who you're with when you get there. The present pulled him gently back as the train's rumble grew louder. Through the misted glass he saw its lights appear, two small orbs cutting a path through the gray. The sound deepened, filling the quiet town with its patient rhythm. Somewhere down by the old grain elevator, the whistle let out a long, low note, a sound that seemed to fold together every dusk he had ever known. Samuel stayed at the window until the train had passed, its light slipping into the distance, its sound fading into the hush of evening. He felt the familiar ache of what had been lost, but also the quiet gratitude for what had been kept. In some ways, that train was a messenger without a message, passing each night as if to remind him that time moves whether we watch it or not. He picked up his cup again, now only warm, and took a slow sip. Outside, the drizzle softened further, the air carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke from somewhere nearby. The porch step, the teacup, the train, they were all part of the same long thread, weaving his life together in ways that didn't ask for explanation. As the clock in the hallway chimed the hour, Samuel let his gaze drift to the horizon, where the last glow of daylight lingered. He thought of Mary's words, of their choice to stay, and how that choice had shaped not only the years they shared, but the man he had become. The house was quiet again, the train was gone, but in that quiet, there was no emptiness, only the steady presence of a life lived deeply in one place, where even the passing of something could feel like its own kind of arrival. The house had grown still again, the kind of stillness that settles in after a long exhale. Samuel lingered by the window for a while, watching the last threads of mist dissolve into the dark. The train was gone now, its sound folded into the quiet like a bookmark slipped into a well-worn page. But the memory it stirred had not left with it. It stayed warm and persistent, like the faint scent of bread lingering in a kitchen hours after it's been baked. His eyes wandered to the cabinet against the far wall, the one with the small brass handle that caught the lamplight just so. He hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. It was where he kept the things that didn't belong anywhere else, items too small to take up space in a drawer, yet too meaningful to be tucked out of sight for good. He crossed the room slowly, his steps creaking in the familiar way that seemed to echo back years of evenings like this. The cabinet door opened with the faintest sigh of old hinges, and inside, beneath a folded wool scarf and an empty glass jar, sat the small wooden box Mary had once given him. It was unremarkable to look at. No ornate carvings, no polished finish, just a plain cedar box, its corners softened from years of handling. When he lifted the lid, the faint scent of cedar rose to meet him, mingling with something sweeter, lavender perhaps from the sachet Mary had placed there long ago. Inside lay a handful of things, a pressed maple leaf, its veins delicate as lace, a folded piece of paper yellowed with time, a single brass button from a coat he no longer had, but it was the small envelope, tied with a faded blue ribbon, that caught his attention tonight. He sat down in his old armchair, the box balanced on his knees. The envelope was light in his hands, and for a moment he just held it, feeling the slight texture of the paper, the way the ribbon had flattened from years of rest. He untied it slowly, the gesture as deliberate as it had been the first time. Inside was a letter, not long, barely half a page, but written in Mary's careful script, the loops and lines of her handwriting as familiar to him as the lines of her face. "Samuel," it began, "if you are reading this, it means you found the box again. I'm glad. You've always been one to keep things, not for their worth, but for the way they hold a moment in place." He smiled faintly. That was true enough. "Do you remember the night we sat on the porch, waiting for the train? It was summer, and the air smelled of rain and cut hay. You said you could hear the whistle long before I could. I didn't tell you then, but I was listening for something else. Your breathing beside me, steady and sure, like the sound of home. Wherever you are when you read this, I hope the train is still passing at dusk, and I hope you are still listening, not for where it might take you, but for the way it reminds you that you're already where you belong." It was signed simply, Mary, Samuelette. The letter rested in his lap, his gaze drifting to the window again. Outside, the lamplight caught in the rain-speckled glass, making the world beyond look soft, almost blurred. He could still hear in his mind the sound of the train passing, its steady rhythm, the way it seemed to carry not just steel and cargo, but the weight of evenings like this. He leaned back in the chair, letting the letter stay open beside him. It wasn't a message meant to change anything. It was one meant to affirm what already was, and in that it felt like a gift that had no end. The clock in the hallway ticked on, each second a quiet note in the room's gentle silence. Samuel closed his eyes, not from weariness, but from the deep comfort of knowing he was held, by the walls around him, by the steady presence of the night, and by the memory of a voice that could turn even the passing of a train into something that stayed. The night had settled deep over the quiet town, a gentle weight of stillness pressing softly against the windows and doors. Out beyond the edge of the lamplight, the darkness was not something to be feared. It was the kind of darkness that came wrapped in familiarity, like a quilt passed down through generations, stitched with every evening that had ever come before. Samuel remained in his armchair, the letter from Mary still open beside him on the small table. The edges of the paper curled slightly under the warmth of the lamp, and the faint scent of cedar from the box lingered in the air, mingling with the cool breath of night slipping in through the smallest cracks in the window frame. He thought about the way the train had passed earlier, its whistle low, steady, drawn out across the open fields like a brushstroke on a wide canvas of dusk. There was no urgency in its sound, no demand for notice, and yet it had filled the space inside him the way a river fills its banks, quietly, naturally, with no need to announce what it had done. The house creaked gently as old houses do when they settle into the night. Somewhere in the kitchen, a clock ticked in unhurried rhythm. The floor beneath his feet held the faint warmth of the day, and the air carried the memory of sunlit hours now folded away into the soft blue-gray of evening. Samuel let his eyes drift over the room. There was the small shelf by the door, holding the row of books he had read and reread over the years. Their spines were worn, their pages softened by time and touch. The old wool throws still rested on the back of the couch, ready to be pulled around shoulders on cooler nights. Near the corner sat the pair of boots he wore for his morning walks, still flecked with traces of last week's rain. Everything here had the feeling of having been lived with, not just used. Each thing held a story, and together they formed a quiet chorus that said, This is a place where someone has been at home. He thought of Mary again, of the nights they'd sat together on the same porch, the train passing at dusk just as it did now. How they had leaned into the silences, not to fill them, but to rest in them. How the whistle had sounded different in winter than in summer, crisper in the cold, rounder and softer when the air was thick with the scent of cut grass. The letter beside him was not the first she had written, but it was the one he knew he would keep closest. It was less a goodbye and more a gentle reminder, like a hand resting on your shoulder, steadying you without needing to speak. He rose slowly, the stiffness in his knees softened by the warmth of the moment, and carried the letter back to the small cedar box. Placing it inside, he let the ribbon fall loosely over it, the way it had when he first found it. He closed the lid, the faint click of the hinge sounding almost like the settling of a thought. Returning to the armchair, Samuel sat again, his gaze moving to the darkened window. The reflection of the room floated there, lamp glow, wood grain, the curve of the chair, and beyond it, the suggestion of the quiet town lying still under the stars. Somewhere out there, far beyond the houses and trees, the train was running again, its steady motion threading through the dark, carrying its soft echo towards someone else who might be listening. Samuel leaned back, letting his head rest against the worn cushion. The sound wasn't here now, but he could hear it anyway. The way memory has its own kind of hearing, and the heart its own kind of sight. In that moment, he felt no need to wish for anything more. The night was whole as it was, the room, the letter, the train's echo fading into stillness, and the knowledge that the same dusk would come again tomorrow. He let his eyes close, not as an act of ending, but of settling. Like the train disappearing into the horizon, his thoughts slipped into the gentle distance, carrying him toward rest. And in the quiet, the world seemed to breathe with him, slow, steady, at peace. The lamp's glow pooled softly around him, and the night outside held the house in its patient, familiar arms. All was well, and so, as the night folds gently around you, we leave Samuel in the quiet safety of his home, the letter resting in its cedar box, and the train's memory still drifting softly through the air. The world beyond the window has grown still, and the darkness holds no weight, only the steady comfort of knowing you are safe, here, now, wherever you are tonight. May your thoughts settle like leaves on calm water. May your breathing slow, your shoulders loosen, and your heart find the quiet it's been searching for. Sleep deeply, and let this night carry you toward the kind of rest that feels like coming home. If you've been here listening, I'd love to know, what story would you like me to tell you next? Share it gently in the comments, and perhaps one evening soon, we'll meet again in the stillness and wander there together.